Saturday, November the 27th, 1982, by Yatesy. Do you all have Chumashim? If you don't, would you like to raise your hands and we'll provide them? Does anybody not have a Chumash? I'm going to read the 30th chapter of the book of Genesis, which was our reading this morning. We read the Torah over a 3-year period, triennial cycle. I'm going to read it from the New Jewish Publication Society translation, which you do not have. You have in front of you the, I suspect, the 1917 translation. And the reason why the Jewish Publication Society of America's recent translation of the entire Bible is new is because it's the first time that the English translation has been made directly from the original Hebrew, the Masoretic text. Previous translations tended to be revisions of earlier translations, such as the Luther translation, the Tyndale, the King James Version, which were based largely on the Latin translation. So that this translation is the one that we really should be using in the synagogue, except we can't afford it. That's number one. And secondly, it's impractical because there are 3 bulky volumes, there is no Hebrew, and there's no way to use it in the synagogue. Ideally speaking, we should have the Sonsino Chumash, the one that you have in front of you. The ideal thing would be to have the Hebrew text that you have in front of you, the New English translation, and a different commentary. As you can see, that is a utopian proposal, so we will have to accept the imperfection of your having. However, you will be able to see where the translation differs. The important point is that this translation went back to what we call the Masoretic text, the oldest Hebrew text. Most of the other translations were based either on the Greek translation, which was made about 23 centuries ago, or the Latin translation, which was made 15 centuries ago. And in going back to the original text, obviously there are certain, and it takes into consideration, of course, all the new archaeological discoveries and all the new linguistic information that has been learnt since the 1917 translation. Now, in reading this through, of course, I am happy to entertain you, but that is not the only purpose of my reading this translation of this chapter through. I want you to participate in the discussion of the chapter, and various, particularly these points. Are there any biblical types in chapter 30? By types, I mean, are there any patterns or paradigms which exist here in one form, but which are reflected in other parts of the Bible? I'll give you an example of a type. An example of a type would be Jonah being thrown into the water and the generation of the flood being drowned. That is to say, an image in which something comparable is taking place on a different level, different numbers, different context, but a similar kind of pattern. Do we have any biblical types here? Are there any particular kinds of patterns which are found elsewhere? Also, do we have any biblical characters, I suppose, not in the sense of personalities, but I can't think of a better word than type for this also, a kind of a theme, something that is repeated over and over again in the Bible, and do we find it in this chapter? Thirdly, I'm particularly anxious in any reactions which indicate that you listen to it as if it were a piece of literature, at least worth listening to. I'm sure you've all heard of a version of the story of the man who comes home and his wife says to him, did you have a nice day? Yes, this, that, and the other, and then at the end, anything else? Oh, yes, I forgot. I knocked your mother down when I was taking the car to the garage. Oh, and I forgot to get the potatoes. If somebody would refer to forgetting to get the potatoes from the supermarket in the same spirit as knocking the mother-in-law down, unless it was a very special mother-in-law relationship, of course, one would assume that there was something wrong with the emotional response of the person concerned. This is what I often detect in the congregation. The most outrageous things can be read in public in synagogue, but as long as they're in the Bible, they go over you with nary an effect. In other words, as long as the Bible says it, it's okay. If you saw it anywhere else, you would scream, get up, walk out, some kind of reaction. But as long as it's in the Bible, somehow the argument seems to run, well, if the rabbi says so, it has to be okay. Or if the rabbi does it, it has to be all right. Or if it's the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people, and if all the other Jews accept this, it has to be all right. So what I'm asking for is a teleological suspension of the moral, if one could adapt a phrase by Kierkegaard. That is to say, to try really to pretend that you're reading this, you're hearing this for the first time. You've never seen this chapter before. You have no preconceived ideas. And I would like you to react to it in terms of your current sensibilities and not the way you ought to react to something that you hear in the synagogue. I can see from your faces already that I have asked the impossible. Almost as impossible as the new Bible that we would like to use in the synagogue. At any rate, you have on page 30 in your Chumashim, chapter 30, page 110. I am reading this chapter, and I'd like you to listen to the chapter in terms of these requests I am making to see if you can discover yourself in this chapter any typical biblical characters, any biblical typology, patterns which exist in other parts of the Bible. Why there should be types in the Bible, of course, is something else again, which we're not going to deal with right now. Oh, finally, of course, if you simply don't understand the chapter and have no reactions in terms of the three questions I've asked you, maybe you simply have questions you would like to ask, and those will also gratefully be received in extremis. When Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children, she became envious of her sister. And Rachel said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob was incensed at Rachel and said, can I take the place of God who has denied you fruit of the womb? She said, here is my maid Bilhah. Consort with her, that she may bear on my knees, and that through her I too may have children. So she gave him her maid Bilhah as concubine, and Jacob cohabited with her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God has vindicated me. Indeed, he has heeded my plea and given me a son. Therefore she named him Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, a fateful contest I wage with my sister. Yes, and I have prevailed. So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as concubine. And when Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, Leah said, what luck? So she named him Gad. When Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, Leah declared, what fortune, meaning, women will deem me fortunate, so she named him Asher. Once at the time of the wheat harvest, Reuben came upon some mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, was it not enough for you to take away my husband, that you would also take away my son's mandrakes? Rachel replied, I promise he shall lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came home from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you are to sleep with me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. God heeded Leah, and she conceived and bore him a fifth son. And Leah said, God has given me my reward for having given my maid to my husband. So she named him Issachar. When Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son, Leah said, God has given me a choice gift. This time my husband will exalt me, for I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun. Lastly, she bore him a daughter and named her Dinah. Now God remembered Rachel. God heeded her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. So she named him Joseph, which is to say, may the Lord add another son for me. After Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, give me leave to go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, that I may go. For well you know what services I have rendered you. But Laban said to him, if you will indulge me, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me on your account. And he continued, name the wages due from me, and I will pay you. But he said, you know well how I have served you and how your livestock has fared with me, for the little you had before I came has grown to much, since the Lord has blessed you whenever I turned. And now, when shall I make provision for my own household? Laban said, whatever you say I shall pay you. And Jacob said, pay me nothing, but do this thing for me. I will again pasture and keep your flocks. Let me pass through your whole flock today, removing from there every speckled and spotted animal, every dark-colored sheep, and every spotted and speckled goat. Such shall be my wages. In the future, when you go over my wages, let my honesty toward you testify for me. If there are any among my goats that are not speckled or spotted, or any sheep that are not dark-colored, they are there by theft. And Laban said, very well, let it be as you say. But that same day he removed the streaked and spotted he-goats, and all the speckled and spotted she-goats, every one that had white on it, and all the dark-colored sheep, and left them in the charge of his sons. And he put a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob was pasturing the rest of Laban's flock. Jacob then got fresh shoots of poplar, and of almond, and plane, and peeled white stripes in them, laying bare the white of the shoots. The rods that he had peeled he set up in front of the goats in the troughs, the water receptacles that the goats came to drink from. Their mating occurred when they came to drink. And since the goats mated by the rods, the goats brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted young. But Jacob dealt separately with the sheep. He made these animals face the streaked or wholly dark-colored animals in Laban's flock. And so he produced special flocks for himself, which he did not put with Laban's flocks. Moreover, when the sturdier animals were mating, Jacob would place the rods in the troughs in full view of the animals, so that they mated by the rods. But when the feebler animals mated, he did not place them there. Thus, the feeble ones went to Laban, and the sturdy to Jacob. So the man grew exceedingly prosperous, and came to own large flocks, maidservants, men-servants, camels, and asses. Well, I will start off with one immediate reaction that I have. The babies come so quickly. I am reminded of watching on Channel 13 National Geographic photographing of plants, of flowers, where they photograph them very slowly, but when they show it to you, you see a rose opening, budding, opening, and all in something that took several days or several weeks, perhaps. You see in a very brief time, especially in the plant kingdom. I mean, we all know that even in those days, a baby took 9 months to grow, give or take, a few weeks on either side. And the intensity with which this chapter is projected, it's like, baby, here, it's almost as if the woman's womb has been photographed the way the National Geographic Society photographs the flowers, so it's up, out, 6 children within the flash of 6 verses. That's my first reaction to it, which clearly makes me ask, how exactly are we supposed to take this chapter? All right, that was just to get you all warmed up, and now it's all yours. Yes?
The thing that bothers me on first blush is that both Bilhah and Zilpah are virtually vetted for Rachel and Leah. The handmaidens conceive and give birth to the children, and yet they're almost treated in the Bible as the property of Rachel and Leah, who name them and take them as their own child simply because their handmaidens gave birth to them.
All right, now what is your objection to that?
It's as if the handmaidens have no personality, no individuality, no rights.
Yes, but you said that. What's your objection to that?
It's immoral.
It's immoral? Well, I mean, you're reacting to it in terms of modern sensibility here. I mean, we're talking about a society where, obviously, I mean, it must be apparent to everybody in the congregation that sexual arrangements were somewhat different then from what they are now. However, I don't know whether I accept your reaction. You think that the way the 2 concubines were treated, in that they were simply used in the battle of the babies, to advance the genealogical claims in terms of these 2 women. And you find that in other words, you have a very strong feeling that these 2 women were used immorally. But you must realize that in those days, it was a different setup between the sexes, yes.
But, excuse me, you started out the premise as saying
Oh, no, I'm not questioning your reaction. As you will see when the discussion continues, I am puzzled that that was what you reacted to in terms of modern sensibility. Because there seems to me to be things that warrant cry out aloud for long before poor Bilhah and Zilpah, who after all said and done in the context of the age, didn't expect anything better because they were concubines and not wives. Emily? Yes, I think that's a remarkable point. I hope you all saw it. As a matter of fact, this is typology. This is what we call typology in the Bible. The Bible is a very curious document. Stories that appear disparate and different, often looked at from a slightly different shift in perspective, turn out to be exactly the same story. It's surprising because the manifest way in which the stories are presented make them look totally different. What could be more different than Jacob trying to rip off his uncle in terms of, well, I'm prejudging the issue. I mean, some of you may think it was simply good investment policy. What is the difference between Jacob trying to rip off his... nothing could seem to be further different than Jacob trying to, go in for some kind of pre-Mendelian cross-fertilizing to produce a lot of animals, and the preoccupation with procreation in the first. It looks quite different. But what Emily draws attention to is that there is juxtaposition. Juxtaposition makes a statement in biblical language. That is to say, simply to put two things side by side already makes a statement. Because the question implicit in putting two things side by side is, why are these two things put side by side? One has to have some relevance to the other, or some comment is being made. And there's no question about it that Emily is right. On some level, a judgment is being made by the author of the chapter that on some level, what Jacob was doing with the animals and what he was doing or what the women, it wasn't really what he was doing, because Jacob looks rather passive to some extent. The poor fellow's pushed around from pillar to post. I mean, one wife says to him, "Okay, when he gets up, it's your night tonight." The poor fellow comes home from Wall Street, schlepping himself along. Instead of a dry martini, he's given a proposition as soon as he crosses the threshold. It seems almost ruthless the way he's treated. But that is a parallel. In other words, two kinds of breeding, two kinds of ruthless breeding, two kinds of breeding in which the only concern is procreation in large numbers. It's almost as if I can add to what Emily has said, since we know the whole story, we assume all those who worship at the SAJ know the whole story. We know that what we have today is a segment in a storyline which begins with Abraham being told by God, if you'll forgive the mixing up of the two imageries, that his descendants will be as many as Jacob's animals. That is to say, the same kind of multiplication. Your seed shall be as the sand on the seashore, as the stars in the heaven, and you will multiply. That's the point. You will multiply. There'll be many. There'll be a lot. It'll be very prosperous. In these shall all the families of the earth be blessed. There are two things going along here. One is the promise by God to Abraham through Isaac and Jacob and their descendants that the Jewish people will be very, very many. But there's an underside caricature of this type, what we might call an anti-type of this, that there's something rather obscene and vulgar about it. It's almost as if the biblical author unconsciously, by placing these two things together, is saying, well, what can I do? If the Jews are going to survive, we have to accept the myth. We have to believe that God said that we have to multiply. But if you ask me a question, all this business of the mating, the procreation that's going on, and the haste with which it's done, it's like gefährlich. It's got to be done right now because we can't wait. Do it tonight. Who's sleeping with whom tonight? They have a note. You have an image that in the patriarch's tent, there's a kind of a board like you used to have in camp. Who has to peel potatoes today? Who's sleeping with who tonight? Get with it, Larry, quick. He's waiting for you. Can't wait, the baby. Got to get our baby schedule on order. So we have a type and an antitype within this chapter, which of course have to be understood in terms of the wider biblical story, namely this central command to God, in which God says of God to the Jews, in which he says, be fruitful and multiply in general, after the creation, be fruitful and multiply in general, and to the Jew in particular, have as many children as you can. You must become the largest race in the entire world. And the other side of that is a sense of almost embarrassment. There's an almost satiric contrast in this antitype, which brings up Barbara's point, namely, and look what Jacob did in order to produce masses of animals in his flock. Yes?
There's also a parallel between Leah and Rachel's walking over the mandrakes and Jacob and Esau's walking.
Beautiful, 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 very good. I think that also is there. That is to say, the two brothers argue over the mess of pottage, and here the two wives argue over the mandrakes. I'm not exactly an expert on aphrodisiacs. It was not something that was taught at seminary. And nobody seems to know what mandrakes are. Maybe it was ancient grass or something comparable, which may have believed, it was certainly believed. The word in Hebrew is dudaim, and it does seem to have some overtone of dod or dodi, and therefore some kind of love potion. Clearly, there was a belief that this kind of ancient turnip, if it was eaten, would stimulate desire, and the argument was over this, and that is an excellent point. My reaction to that little piece, I was too preoccupied with the surface story to go into under the surface, the rather callous way in which Rachel, after all, this man worked 14 years for her. The callous way in which in exchange for some grass, she doesn't care whether her husband sleeps with her or not. In other words, go ahead, you can have him for tonight. I want that's more important to me. I want the mandrakes, you can have him, the husband who worked for her for 14 years. So those two things are going on at the same time. Yes?
I just wonder if we're talking about looking at a matriarchal kind of control here. It's something that everything I have read or understood about ancient times always implied that the man was in control. And reading this one would think that these women are dictating to this man how he will spend his time and with whom he will spend his time.
Well, Arlene, I'm surprised at you, because although we know that manifestly and theoretically the Hebraic tradition, the Jewish tradition, has always been patriarchal, we know that the women always got their own way. I mean, the men made the big decisions, and the women made the small decisions. You know the story, don't you? You don't know the story. Well, I told it to you last week, but apparently you know the story. The woman who says, our marriage is perfect because I make the big decisions, I make the small decisions, my husband makes the big decisions. My husband makes decisions about the rate of interest and the war in Vietnam and who's going to be the next president, and I decide where the children go to school and where we go for vacation and how the budget is spent. You see, but you are right. I think this does definitely indicate that it does give us an insight into the so-called patriarchal society where the men thought they were deciding who they were going to sleep with, and in fact the women had decided before they got home for a variety of different reasons. Rosalind?
Yes. What concerns me are a number of little hints that are given. The planting of the name Dina. All that you have all these sons, and suddenly you drop in the name of a daughter, which is fairly rare. And whether that was because later on, when this text was written, they already knew some of the other stories that were going to come, and therefore they dropped this little hint like a teaser, or whether it really meant that it was a concept of the worth and the importance of women that they couldn't acknowledge fully, but rather, in this sense, by placing it in such a prominent way, there was an acknowledgement that there was a role being played that was beyond them, and they didn't know quite how to handle it. On the other hand, I would like to say for poor Jacob that his father-in-law was not exactly
Yes. 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 You might say that Jacob and Laban deserved each other on some level. Yes. They were well matched in their chicanery and trickery. Yes. Okay. Yes. I reacted differently. I thought that was just a throwaway verse, as if to say a kind of contemptuous. Oh, and there was also a daughter. You know, the boys were the ones that really mattered. But there was also a daughter. Arlene. Please.
Where is there, in this early stage, a daughter by name? We talk about daughters a lot, but it's not actually...
That's a lovely question. Yes, I don't know, yes. Well, Rebecca, yes. Leah and Rachel.
But those were wives. They were named because they were...
Yeah, yeah. No, your point, I saw your point as a kind of a throwaway. The low esteem on some level in which the idea of a daughter, because they wanted the descent to be through the males. Arlene?
On the question of mandrake, I'm more inclined to believe that for fertility, I understand something to arouse a husband. I don't think arousing him was even a question. It seemed like male role was fixed, expected. I mean, it was a duty. It wasn't something that had to be requested. And along the same lines, I don't think it was necessarily callous of Rachel to barter off her husband's services the way she did, because the fertility and not the love seemed to be the primary factor. When she was sad about not having conceived, he was not sympathetic at all. Why blame me, is what he said. It's God's doing. Are you putting me in God's place for your barrenness? So why should she feel sorry for it? You know, why should it didn't encourage her tender feelings. She was encouraged just to gear herself toward producing, toward procreating.
Yeah, but you see, I had a reaction to that too, and I accept your emendation. I think you're right, probably. Although the translation does seem to indicate it was a love potion, but let us assume that it is some kind of fertility pill or whatever. And it's conceivable, you know, in the same way that digitalis was used for thousands of years before they discovered why it does people with a heart condition good. May well be that there were some potions that the ancient witches or whatever, those who understood, knew would facilitate or make conception easier. There's another question which I thought that one of the women would at least have raised already, and that is, how does this polyandry, I suppose the word is, sit with you? The idea that husbands are shared at the drop of a mandrake. I mean, it seems, you know, we're always told that monogamy is a central biblical, in spite of the fact that there were all these concubines around, that monogamy was the basic goal. That we read in the book of Genesis, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, not to his wives. And therefore the highest goal in the Bible was monogamy. And at the 31st chapter of the book of Proverbs, Eshet chayil meyimtza, it doesn't say women of worth who can find, it says a woman of worth who can find. So we have several points in the Bible where it clearly seems to indicate that monogamy was a goal. But here the issue seems to be, and people have the polygamy notion, of course, back of that, but the idea was that this was accepted, but the main ideal was monogamous. But here the man is being pushed from pillar to post. The women are using the men for procreative purposes. The men seem rather passive, and the women don't seem to mind the fact that their husbands are sharing more than one woman. Now that I thought I'd get some reaction from some woman in the congregation to that, but apparently not. I'll put it on the back burner right now. We have a few other people. So, Mark and then Rabbi Lewitis. Mark and then Florence. I was waiting for that one. Yes, go on. Yes.
And the other connection is I was struck by the ferocity of the fight. The women are worthwhile only if they conceive. And the contrast that struck me was with Hannah, who was also barren,
Right.
But the reaction there is she's so worried about, I love you, and you're good enough to me and 10 children. And here it's a contrast.
Oh, well, you're saying something very, very beautiful there. Let's unravel what you've just said. First of all, Mark very rightly points out what I thought you'd all be first in the field with, namely the notion that we have here a very central biblical theme or biblical character, namely the woman who wants to have a child but can't. It even comes up in Hallel. Moshivi akeret habayit im habarim semecha. God is described. God is, among the many things that are ascribed to God, is that He is the one that gives barren women children. And we have it with Sarah. We have it with Rachel. We have it with Hannah. We have it with the woman in the, is it the books of Kings? Elijah the Shunammite woman. And I think there are other examples. I would link this notion of the, excuse me sir, would you sit down? Thank you. I always get nervous when people stand up. I feel they're going to run out any minute. By the way, would you people sitting up there like to come and join us? Because yes, we'd be very happy to have you down here. Okay? If you all come in one lump, that is. Thank you. You're most welcome. I would link this notion of the woman who cannot have children with the question that was raised last week, namely, why is it that God works through sin? We saw that the Messiah stems, in other words, or from suffering, or from things which are not normal, things which are bizarre, things which are twisted. That the Messiah comes from Ruth, who was a Moabitess. Ruth, Peretz, the ancestor of the Messiah, is born of the union between Judah and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, which is an incestuous union. That Boaz marries Ruth. Ruth is a Moabitess. Here also it seems, and we discovered that God works through the downtrodden, the oppressed, and apparently even the sinners. Now what are we to make of this? That God, well, of course the Jewish commentators tend to say the reason why is that God loves to hear the prayers of the righteous, and if He deprives them of children, they pray all the more beautifully for Him. You don't like that one? No, neither do I, but that's what the Midrash says. What can I do? But there is this theme here. But Mark is saying something else, which is of a much more sensitive notion. Namely, and this is all part of the Bible, that Rachel says to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." What Mark is asking us to do is to compare this dialogue between Jacob and Rachel, and then Jacob loses his temper with her, begins to shout, right? Typical sort of thing. A woman is in need and vulnerable, and she's very upset, and instead of the husband putting his arm around her and consoling her, he gives her a mouthful. Presumably because he himself is very uptight about this business. After all said and done, this is the woman he worked for 14 years for, and this is the woman that he claims to love most, and he can't produce a child from her. He must be feeling some guilt in himself, or some kind of tension in himself, to explain why he bawled her out when she said something that really required positive reinforcement and support rather than accusations. However, Mark compares it with Hannah and Peninnah, where Peninnah has children. By the way, this is another type. Here we have this is another type. As a matter of fact, I would say that Hannah and Peninnah and Elkanah are the type, and this is the anti-type. Because in fact, the ideal is where the husband, the woman says, my rival, my co-wife is having all these children, I have no children, and the husband, instead of saying, well, who do you think I am? Do you think I'm God? All I've got to do all day is daven for you and pray for children? He says, don't worry. I love you. Who cares? Who's talking about children? Am I not better to thee, Elkanah says, than 10 sons? 10 sons. He doesn't just say 10 children. He says 10 sons. It's almost impossible to believe that those two stories belong in the same book. The spiritual quality of Elkanah rings so well with us moderns, does it not? The notion that every life has value. The notion that just because somebody doesn't have a child doesn't mean they're finished. You see, Rachel says something terrible. Rachel says something terrible. She says, give me children. If I don't have a child, I'm dead. That's terrible. That's awful. Is that the only raison d'etre of a woman? Then what happens with all the women that didn't have children? Were they dead? Was Anna Freud dead because she never had a child? Or some of the greatest women in history? Or never mind the greatest women, the most ordinary women in history. Is that the only thing a woman can do to become human, to become real? It's a terrible thing that she says. Of course, the commentators pick it up. Rashi says, from hence we learn that anybody who doesn't have children is like a corpse. I mean, that's all we need from Rashi this week. That's all we need from Rashi. You know, we've got a lot of dead people running around. So I'm thinking of Viktor Frankl. I'm going to come around to Mordecai and then Naomi. Viktor Frankl once tells this story about a woman who was a nurse for 50 years, one of these top-notch hospitals where she really gave a tremendous amount with the terminally ill. And then this nurse caught cancer. And she refused to be consoled. She knew that she was dying. She was smart enough to know from what, because of course then she'd been treating people in terminal condition for all these years. And Viktor Frankl went to visit her. And he asked her a few questions, and she wanted to commit suicide. She didn't want to live. The whole thing wasn't worth a candle. It was ridiculous. Life was waste. Life was full of vanity, and she just had gone completely to pieces. And Viktor Frankl said, "You know what you're doing?" He says, "What you're doing is you're damning the 50 years of work as a nurse that you did. You're saying that what you did when you consoled other people in a condition comparable to yours now was dust and ashes, and it was a waste of time. You have an occasion right now either to indict your entire life or to remember what you were able to do to other people and allow somebody to do that for you." I don't know whether this would always work, but the story ends that she pulled out of her depression and was able to see how, in fact, the way she was reacting to dying and reacting to the way people who were comforting her when she was dying really placed questions around the quality of what she had done for those 50 years in her life. And of course she had the possibility of working through them because she had time. So that we have here the ideal, in the same way that the ideal, I think now we can see that we have a few types and antitypes coming out of this discussion this morning. We have the monogamous ideal. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, they shall become one flesh, one-on-one for an entire life, with the 31st chapter of Proverbs, Eshet Chayil, being recited every Friday evening to as it were, to affirm that ideal monogamous union, and the reality of the Bible that men and women shared each other in terms of the biblical need to be fruitful and multiply and have a large Jewish people. But that there was the type and the antitype, and that those two types, that also bred another type and antitype. The ideal relationship between a man and a woman, which perhaps is adumbrated in the story of the Garden of Eden, where there are no children. But also there was no sex, so I don't think we can give them much credit for that. On any reading, it looks as if sex didn't start until after the Garden of Eden, and since the business of the fig leaf looks very much like the kind of shock that children get when they enter puberty, locking the bathroom door, throwing their mothers out, and getting very sort of protective, that somehow the Garden of Eden story ends with puberty. In other words, that the original fall is sex, which would make a lot of sense. But that's a separate topic. But you do have the other contrast of the man-woman relationship, where the relationship is sui generis, and neither the man nor the woman, that's the point, is looked upon for what they can produce, but for what they are. Whether it's producing a lot of money or a lot of babies, that's not the issue. The issue is, what is the quality of the relationship? Can a man turn to a woman and say, am I not better to you than 10 sons? And can a woman not turn to a man and say, am I not better to you than $10 million? Or 10 million sheep, or whatever. Cuts both ways. It cuts both ways. Mordecai.
I think that Mark said it. The basic pattern here is the barren woman. I might add, for example, that Rebecca too was barren until she prayed and had twins.
Right, another one.
I'd like to add that the metaphor is extremely important. That the barren woman not only bears a child, but she becomes the mother of the child who is chosen by God. Sarah is the mother of Isaac, not of Ishmael, and Rachel is the mother of Joseph, who of course is the leader of the 10 tribes of Israel. And just as you point out that you have it in Hallel, you also have this metaphor in Hallel, Even ma'asu havonim.
Haital Rosh Pina, yes. Builders rejected.
becomes the cornerstone. So it's the barren woman who later becomes the mother of the Messiah or the king or the leader.
That's an excellent point again, and I think here again we are in the terms of the framework of our discussion last week when I asked the question, why would a culture affirm that God chooses the weak rather than the strong? Why would a culture's myth, why would the myth of the Jewish people insist that God does not work through the strong and the affluent, but through the weak and the broken and the contrite in spirit? And the answer would be that the myth had to have been generated at a time when the Jewish people were low and out and exiled and broken and shattered. And therefore their myth reflects their belief that even though they are broken and shattered and defeated, that God works through defeat, God works through impotence, and also by analogy, God works through barrenness. So it would be, I think, part of the same pattern. Florence? Could you stand, Florence? I think your voice will carry better. Well, I'm not sure that I'm not... Yes. I'm not sure I understand your question. Let me try to reformulate it. I hear you say something which I find fascinating. You're saying something which seems to be in the family of behavior patterns that we've just been talking about. You seem to be saying that that although Jacob appears to be manipulated by many people, nevertheless, it's through him that God is going to work the line. And what you're saying is, I think, comparable that the person who works actively and plans and schemes and is Machiavellian and knows everything that's going to happen is not necessarily the person that comes out on top at the end. That very often, to use Mordecai's quotation, the stone that the builders rejected, precisely the person that's used or is menial or is controlled by others, turns into the one through whom the succession comes. He's going along with it. Yes, yeah, I mean, you know, when the guy comes home from work at night and Rachel says to him, no, you're not sleeping here tonight, you got a sleepover. I mean, no, he should put his briefcase down and say, I'm sorry, I'm going to sleep in my own bed tonight. I want to read the New Yorker. Instead, he just goes along with it. Nothing's happening. Yes, sir.
That's one reason why I was weird when Jacob didn't let himself get hoodwinked by Laban, and when Laban played all his spotted cows in his faraway field. I don't know where this fits in, but I just want to raise the question of, and the flocks conceived at the side of the rods, and the flocks bore forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. How the flock conceive based on seeing a spotted rod?
Well, that is something which we would need a geneticist to answer. I have no scientific evidence whatsoever that creatures, animal or human, conceive in terms of what they are looking at the time they are conceiving or produce. Although there are some mythological stories to that effect. There's once a story of a Roman emperor whose wife gave birth to a black child, and she was on the point of having her head chopped off. And she summoned one of his wise men, and the wise man said to him, what kind of drapes did you have in the bedroom at the time that the baby was conceived? And he said, we had some black drapes at that time. And the wise man said, well, that's why, because if you have black drapes in the bedroom, the baby will be black. We don't know whether this story was accepted, but at any rate, the idea was there in the ancient world. I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that what women look at has this kind of effect. I've got several people. We're going to come around to you in a moment. Naomi and then Myron.
Well, the point that I'm not so responsible for what you said about Rachel saying that was a
Yes.
I think you have to look at that in the context of the time when a woman's status was very much involved in her bearing children. And so if she wasn't able to have children, then she really felt that she was nothing, which is really very much in contrast with the present day, when for women having children is not sufficient for their status.
Well, yes, except that Mark's point has to be taken into consideration. Apparently, there were people in the biblical period that did not regard women as lacking in status if they didn't have children. I'm sorry?
But Hannah regarded it that way, and it's understandable that she felt that way about it, and that she was not consoled.
Well, Diana is saying something else. Diana is saying that no matter how beautiful Elkanah was to Hannah, it didn't help her, because the current view was that in fact there was no status for a woman who didn't have children. I don't know how to answer that question right now. Myron?
I think the whole reading, not only chapter 30, part of the reading, is an intermezzo.
Maybe you could turn around and half sort of talk to people behind you, because I can hear you.
It's sort of an intermezzo, because I think it's a commentary on what came before part of it, the whole reading, and commentary that's going to come after. We didn't read the part about the well, or the part about the selection of Leah and Rachel as his wives. But when Jacob comes to Laban's household, or comes to the area, in contrast to Eliezer, he comes poor. He comes with nothing. I was remembering the discussion we had at the well 2 weeks ago, when Eliezer came with gold, and what's her name?
Rebecca.
Washed his feet and gave him water. Here, the exact opposite happens. Jacob removes the rock, comes poor, clearly bedraggled, as far as I can see from the reading. He's the one who raises the rock and waters her sheep. And it's the exact opposite of what happened 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
Second of all, the next thing that happens is when a week later, Laban says, well, look, you got to work for me to earn your feet. I think that's essentially the import. I'm trying to remember. And he will get, he wants Rachel as a wife, but works 7 years. And the 7-year motif, of course, is important also later on. But he gets Leah rather than Rachel. He gets fooled in the same way that he fooled his father Isaac. He got the weaker sister, the blind sister, the one he should have known. I mean, Jacob took the birthright.
Interesting.
He stole it.
Yes.
Later stole Jacob. I mean, it's a commentary being made. He's getting his comeuppance. He's being pointed on his own facade all the way through. We come to this chapter. We now know that Jacob has been talked about as a trickster in many ways. And so is his uncle Laban. And through no kind of inner goodness of Jacob, he's going to have all these children. Let's ignore the issue of the women for the moment. He has 12 sons in one way or another. Abraham struggled, Isaac struggled. Jacob has no problem whatsoever. They're all over him. And he's able to produce 12 sons through nothing good about him. Not only that, he doesn't even say he's a believer in Yahweh, because before, when he leaves Canaan, he says, I will worship you, God, only if you bring me back. And bring me back rich also while you're at it. But it's a conditional statement he makes here. Then in the second part of this, I have to ask a question about Joseph's upbringing and his brother's upbringing. Because Joseph is brought up as a part of which Jacob is successful. And he's successful by tricking Laban and doing certain kinds of things. Joseph is only 5 or 6 years old, at least as far as I can tell. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of influence that is just going on. His brothers saw Jacob being tricked totally. They were born earlier. And they're almost dullers later on. But Joseph is a different kind of person. He's a chip off his father's block, but the block is the latter half of this chapter.
That was it's like a rich fruit cake, Myron. I'm going to have difficulty in disentangling all the currents. I love the notion that we have another type, antitype, in Rebecca watering the animals and the man, and Jacob having to do the opposite, and Eliezer of Damascus bringing the gold and the earrings, all that affluence and Laban coming with the shirt on his back, Jacob coming with the shirt on his back. But particularly, I think, the notion that Joseph observed his father at a time when his luck was turning, when he was moving upwards, and that might be one of the reasons, in addition to the fact that Joseph was the child of the favorite wife, why Joseph seems to be a cut ahead from a different stable of the other children, because we know that if a father is suddenly doing well at business over a particular period, supposing if one child is born when things are rather depressing or depressed or during a depression, and then another child is born during a time when the fortunes of the family are going upwards, the children's experiences are going to be completely different. The whole way in which the character, a great deal of, not all of character of course, but a great deal of character results from identification with the father. The mother also is included, but the father especially would play a great role, and all of these points throw a great deal of light. Now, I think I just want to stop very briefly, because I've never really explained in depth why it is that the Bible needs to have all these types and antitypes, all these stories that mirror each other, which are inversions of each other, which are upside-down versions or inside-out versions of each other. Why the themes are repeated over and over again? You have to know something about communications theory. If you want to get some information over, you have to put as much information as you can in as many ways you can in that information in order that some of it is going to get through. It's a little bit like the salmon that spawns thousands and thousands of eggs, so that it's guaranteed that at least a few score will turn into a mature salmon and will again carry on the evolution tradition. The purpose of the myth, rock bottom, was that it was adaptational. To put it as crudely and as simply as possible, at a particular point in Jewish history, when the fortunes of the Jewish people was as low as they ever could have been, and the decision had to be made by the Board of Trustees. I mean, I'm putting it as ridiculously as possible, but I mean, you have to think of it in terms of representative democracy on some level, otherwise you're not going to be able to understand it. We could go into greater detail. We can do it that way. It doesn't hurt. That is to say, some decision had to be made by the spiritual leaders of the people, how to keep these people going. If there was enough will to survive, how could they keep going? The thing was a myth. Obviously, you don't decide on a myth through a committee, but it's easy to talk about this way. The myth was a myth which said that this defeat in which we find ourselves isn't a random defeat, it's a meaningful defeat. It is a defeat which comes about because we violated the law of God. If we obey the law of God, then God will redeem us. And the leaders of the people made sure that the law of God, which had to be obeyed in order for a restoration of the fortunes to take place, was of such an order that it was cohesive and conducive to spirituality, conducive to development and maturity and studying and learning, good things. I mean, they didn't put down that people should play mahjong every 3 days, and they should have bridge parties on Thursday night, or they should go to Florida for 6 months a year. They put down the things that should be done, festivals, sacred days, places where studying, so on and so forth. And the central myth, which was very simply, basically, the notion that you are the stone that the builders have rejected. You are the rejected. You are the most lowly of peoples. You are the suffering servants. And yet, if you lead good lives, if you obey God's law, God will restore you to there will be redemption. You have sinned. Acknowledge your sin. There will be redemption. Now that is the central message, and it is placed in the nuclear myth of Judaism in every kind of which way. It's straight, it's gebackt and gedämpft, and every kind of which way you can present this message, it goes through. Bobby, I'm sure you could add much more on this than I can. On the subject of in communication theory, you need a lot of noise. Please, could you give us an example of art? I know you can't hear. I'll repeat after she's finished speaking. Yes. Okay. What Bobby is saying is that in art, the same principle holds as in communication. Here we're talking about communication. We're talking about people developing a story that Jews would tell till the end of time, which would help them to adapt and survive in unprecedented conditions. As I've indicated, one of our problems is that since 1948, at any rate, since 1967, we have some severe problems with this notion that the Jews are the underdog, since now there are 4 armies in the world: the American army, the Russian army, and the Chinese army, and the fourth in power and strength, apparently, according to the Institute in London which studies these things, is the army of Israel. So the myth somehow doesn't quite fit with the reality right now, which is one of the big problems that we Jews have not yet come to terms with in the 20th century. Some people think they have come to terms with it, but it's a little too simplistic. It's not as easy as that. Myths don't change overnight. So we have this problem. But what I want you to understand is the reason why we have overtones and echoes and inversions of type, anti-type throughout the Bible is that the authors of this book were geniuses. They made a work of art in which they were trying to stress a central message, but also to stress the central message, they were giving other versions of that message, isomorphic versions of that message, in different modalities. So that in a sense, the same story appears over and over and over again. You don't know you're taking it in, you're taking it in subliminally. One almost might say that the authors of the Bible were the original founders of Madison Avenue. In other words, an idea is being sold, and it's being sold redundantly. It is being hammered home over and over and over again. And ultimately, of course, the reason why the Jewish liturgy is so incredibly unoriginal, that 90% of the traditional prayer book simply consists of either Psalms or the reading from the Torah. Think of what we do in synagogue. We either read the Psalms, or we read from the Torah, or we read prayers which are mosaics of verses which come from the Torah. Because if you manipulate the verses from the Torah enough, you can always find sequences where if you put them together, you can get different meanings. You know, like people do this when they want to distort a tape recording. So they have a tape recording of somebody's voice, they can break up the sentences or sometimes even the words and make a patchwork and make out that the man was doing something completely different from what he was saying. So some of the very prayers in the book come from are composites. The purpose is that the message should get through. And the message that gets through is that God is not impressed by strength. God is impressed by those who fear his word. David? Did you have your hand? Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me just one moment. You had a go. I just want to see. Is anybody else who had their hand up who hasn't spoken already? Yes, there's a gentleman over there. At the back? Yes. Go ahead. Yes, I think it's a continuation of the same theme. It's very much there, and I think that one of the crucial points in this chapter, going back to the original National Geographic magazine point that I made, where you see a rose open in 5 seconds flat, is related to the fact that the chapter as a whole, I suspect, is an etiological myth to account for the origins of the Jewish people, the 12 tribes. Because we really have no evidence at all from any source outside of the Bible that this is the neat geometrical way in which the Jewish people descended. You know, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes. It's clearly oversimplistic, and it's almost as if the author of chapter 30 in speeding up the process of having babies so quickly is saying to us over the centuries, not consciously but unconsciously, of course this isn't the way it really happened, but you know, we couldn't just present the Jewish people like Athena coming out of the head of Zeus. There had to be some history. We know that all cultures create their pedigree, their genealogy, when a significant event happens in their lives which makes them feel that now they are a unified people, and the same process must have happened with our ancestors. So what we are here in the presence of is some rewriting of the past, and it's too geometrical, it's too symmetrical, there's too much symmetry here, and the speed with which the children are born. We need 12 babies very quickly, so we're going to find them, and the story is written around that.
Oh, I had wanted to ask whether anywhere in the story, it seems to me that women are given the responsibility for the sex of the child and the barrenness, and I wondered if anywhere in the Bible it shows that the man is the one who determines the sex and whether there is a barren man.
What is being said is that women are responsible both for the sex of the child in the Bible and for their barrenness or sterility. And the lady wants to know whether there are any barren men in the Bible, or whether the men are whether it is ever acknowledged that in fact men determine the sex of the child. I don't think that information was available to them. Yes, Bobby. Are you relating to the point that I made? Yes, I'm sorry. Okay, we're going. Yes, yeah, that's okay. No, I hear what you're saying. Does anybody want to react to that? I don't think they knew anything. I think it was basically a cultural phenomenon that women were responsible for this, and I don't think that part sits well. I still haven't had a response from any of the ladies in the congregation whether they like the idea of the men being shared. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed. I was hoping that I'd have some response on that one, but all of you are remarkably reticent. I will draw my own conclusions. But at least in asking you to react to this as if you hadn't seen it before, I thought one of the women here would react to this point, because surely this has to be an issue in the 20th century. It has to be an issue today. And the silence is eloquent. Now, Bobby's point, I think, is very well made, that when you get in the Bible certain National Geographic magazine syndrome phenomena, namely where things are so speeded up that it's obvious that the author is trying to say something, where 1,000 generations pass in 5 verses, obviously a point is being made. And Bobby raises the question of whether the creation of the world in 6 days is a kind of an etiological myth itself, in which the author of the Bible is saying, well, it didn't really happen this. If we really told you the way it happened, you wouldn't believe it anyway. In terms of the child who goes to Hebrew school, I'm not going to tell that story again, because you all are supposed to know that story. It's become a midrash, right. Yes? Yes. I'm not sure what you're saying. Oh, you feel sorry for Leah because you feel she's getting a raw deal?
No, I think the authors are sympathetic.
Yes. Actually, what you remind me is one of the points that Myron made that I didn't pick up, the idea that Leah was blind. The blindness of Isaac and the blindness of Leah. And of course, Jacob was also blind because he didn't recognize the difference between Leah and Rachel. So that also comes up. Yes? There's no question about that. There's no question about that. I mean, I'm just thinking right now, the first time in the history of American publishing, a rabbi has a book on the bestseller for something like 56, 58 weeks, and the book comes out of an agonizing experience in which he and his wife gave birth to a son who grew prematurely old and died an old man at the age of 14. I can't think of anything more awful for a parent to have to go through, and it's pure biblical in the sense. Of course, it doesn't compensate It doesn't compensate, but that's the kind of thing. All of us must know in our lives that when things went easy, we didn't do as well as we could do. But when we had to fight against overwhelming odds, the best in us was elicited. That wouldn't be a sufficient point for the entire Bible to be making. Obviously, there has to be more than just Joshua Lot Liebman in the Bible. But that certainly is one of the points that is being made. Leah?
I'd just like to make two points. One, tying two things together. I think I'm picking up what somebody in the back said about Jacob working through the women. Somehow he learned as a child that if he listened to his mother, essentially he would get ahead. And he comes, as Byron said, he comes empty-handed, and what does he confront? He confronts a group of women, all of whom have their own flock, and he has nothing. So he says, listen, why don't I marry him? I'll get me a flock automatically. And as far as the women are going, as far as sharing the men, I think, personally, I've always found the story rather pathetic. I don't think that they had any choice, since their whole status was based on whether they produced or didn't or they didn't produce. I really don't think that they had any choice as far as sharing the man. He was the one that they were allowed to have. They weren't allowed to have more than one husband. They had no option. In order to have status, they had to have children, and they had to have them whatever way they could. And it's very sad to see the way that they kill each other to get children. I mean,
Both points I think are very well made. The last one was a point that struck me forcefully in considering this story, namely that there's a kind of a ruthlessness among the women, and there's a lack of feeling there. It's one thing to say it's a patriarchal society and there are several women to one man. Another thing for the women to so callously make it interchangeable, as if they don't really care because other things are at issue. The first point that you made was extremely important, and it's just slipped my mind.
well, Jacob came empty-handed.
No, the fact that Jacob was brought up with a mother who was manipulative and powerful and was able to outwit the man, and he learned from her that if you want to succeed in life, listen to the women. In other words, we cannot underestimate the influence of family life on the child. And perhaps in conclusion, we might say that one of the messages that was being communicated through all these stories in which the childhood experience determines so profoundly the way the later life was lived, that if you want your child to be a Jew, you know, the way the Jesuits put it, give him to us till he's 7 years old, and then we've got him for life. In other words, how crucially important chinuch, Jewish education, the early years in the home, where the child gets a sense of Jewish roots and so on and so forth, although we hope he also gets some higher moral values than are always apparently in the Bible. It may well be that the authors of the Bible, of course, they could never understand the Gideon concept, the idea that people would put Bibles in motels. They could never have possibly conceived of that. But maybe they thought that if they put these profound messages in the mouths of prissy, missy sissies, nobody would read them. And so they really put these very important messages into the kind of stories that would draw attention because they were weird, bizarre stories which didn't seem religious stories. They seemed, you know, like human life. I mean, life is like that, where people bicker, and I don't know whether women still behave like that. But my experience is somewhat limited. However, it is said that the bickering that goes on between women has not been assuaged even by the feminist revolution, that somehow there is something happens when men and women get together in terms of swapping and interchanging and who is the one who controls and manipulates, which has not changed to this age. But I think we are getting into dangerous waters, and therefore we rise for Aleinu on page 194. Thank you for your cooperation. I've learned a great deal. I hope you've all learned as much as I have this morning. Saturday, December the 4th, 1982, by Yishlach. Please turn in your Chumashim to page 127. If anybody does not have a Chumash, please raise your hand and the ushers will be happy to provide you with one. Would the ushers please provide those who don't have Chumashim with them? Please keep your hands up if you don't have one. We need a few in the front. Does anybody not have a Chumash? Any more Chumashim required? Anybody else want a Chumash? Please raise your hand, we'll give you one. Okay, page 127. This is the reading to this morning. We read the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, over a triennial 3-year cycle. And I'm going to read the New Jewish Publication Society of America translation, the newest translation of the Bible. You can compare it while we are reading it with the text that you have in front of you on page 127. The most recent translation of the Bible by the Jewish Publication Society, made by a committee of Jewish scholars, is the first translation for many, many centuries that is made straight from the original Hebrew text. But the purpose of reading this chapter is not simply to compare the two translations. After I have finished reading the 34th chapter, I invite members of the congregation and our visitors to respond to the reading. The reading touches the modern Jew, I think, at many nerve points, and I will entertain any points from the congregation, either observations which are a comparing of our reading this morning with other readings in the Torah, or questions, or general observations. Page 127 in the Chumashim, and here is a different translation from the one you have in front of you. Now Dinah, the daughter whom Leah had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, chief of the country, saw her and took her and lay with her by force, being strongly drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and in love with the maiden. He spoke to the maiden tenderly. So Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Get me this girl as a wife." Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but since his sons were in the field with his cattle, Jacob kept silent until they came home. Then Shechem's father Hamor came out to Jacob to speak to him. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons, having heard the news, came in from the field. The men were distressed and very angry because he had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing not to be done. And Hamor spoke with them, saying, "My son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You will dwell among us, and the land will be open before you. Settle, move about, and acquire holdings in it." Then Shechem said to her father and brothers, "Do me this favor, and I will pay whatever you tell me. Ask of me a bride price ever so high, as well as gifts, and I will pay what you tell me. Only give me the maiden for a wife." Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor, speaking with guile because he had defiled their sister Dinah, and said to them, "We cannot do this thing, to give our sister to a man who is uncircumcised, for that is a disgrace among us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become like us in that every male among you is circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you and take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell among you and become as one kindred. But if you will not listen to us and become circumcised, we will take our daughter and go." Their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem, and the youth lost no time in doing the thing, for he wanted Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most respected in his father's house. So Hamor and his son Shechem went to the public place of their town and spoke to their fellow townsmen, saying, "These people are our friends. Let them settle in the land and move about in it, for the land is large enough for them. We will take their daughters to ourselves as wives and give our daughters to them. But only on this condition will the men agree with us to dwell among us and be as one kindred, that all our males become circumcised as they are circumcised. Their cattle and substance and all their beasts will be ours, if we only agree to their terms, so that they will settle among us. All who went out of the gate of his town heeded Hamor and his son Shechem, and all males, all those who went out of the gate of his town, were circumcised. On the third day, when they were in pain, Shimon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, brothers of Dinah, took each his sword, came upon the city unmolested, and slew all the males. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword, took Dinah out of Shechem's house, and went away. The other sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the town, because their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds and asses, all that was inside the town and outside, all their wealth, all their children and their wives, all that was in the houses, they took as captives and booty. Jacob said to Shimon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me, making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My men are few in number, so that if they unite against me and attack me, I and my house will be destroyed." But the sons answered, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?" Is it a better translation? You like it better? All right. I would like some reactions. Any reactions? Yes, Hillel. Would you stand, please? Did you all hear that? Good. Any more reactions? Leah?
Speaking of Leah, I would sincerely love to know where Leah is in this story. This is her daughter, it's been raped, and not a word is said about her reaction. I mean, aside from the rather shocking fact that the father doesn't seem to be able to say about it, where's the mother in all this? Her daughter's been raped and she says nothing?
Yes, that's an interesting question, and also I think you draw attention to, Hillel, we have not forgotten your point, but I don't want to react to it right now. Let's... Peretz, I'm sorry. But it is interesting that the ones who get most excited are the brothers. Who is it that says, well, when I was young, we were told to treat our girlfriends like our sisters, which was an awful piece of advice, by the way. Awful piece of advice. I mean, at worst, one would hope that one would start on a higher level. But I'm sure. Did anybody? Was this a thing? Were you asked this in America also, that one should think of other girls as one's sister? Yes, this was a terrible piece of advice, but still, one understood the intentions were good, but the actual implementation wasn't always. Jacob does seem to be remarkably quiet. The Jewish commentators, however, do raise a question about Leah, and since Leah asked the question about Leah, I will indicate what that reaction is. It's not very flattering. We read last week that during the chapter that we read last week, in which most of the 12 sons of Jacob were born, and all the wrangling and the quarreling that took place between Leah and Rachel in terms of who could get more babies quicker, and the way in which, in an attempt to produce more babies, they used their handmaids and allowed their handmaids to sleep with Jacob, just in order that they would have, at least by association, more children, so that not only did Leah have her own children, she had children from her handmaid by Jacob also, and Rachel was unable to produce children until quite advanced in the story, and she produced children from her handmaids. Jacob was the one that was doing double time. He was doing overtime, and there was one verse which particularly upset some of us last week, where Leah has done some kind of deal with Reuven, who has found some aphrodisiac, mandrakes in the field, and is prepared to make some kind of a deal reminiscent of Esau selling the birthright for a mess of pottage. And the Bible says, Vatetse Leah likrato. In other words, before poor Jacob had had a chance to come home and have his dry martini and put his slippers on, she was out there already telling him who he was sleeping with that night in order to get the babies rolling, and showing no concern at all for Jacob's welfare. Since some of you are looking at me as if I'm talking Chinese, we might as well go to the original chapter and see where we are. The particular verse that the commentators draw attention to is page 111, verse 16. We're not going to read the whole chapter, we did that last week, but on page 111, verse 16, we see this, poor Jacob. Jacob came from the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, Thou must come in unto me, for I have surely hired thee with my son's mandrakes. Leah is way ahead, by the way, in the baby competition, in the baby stakes, because Rachel hasn't produced any children of her own at this point. But nevertheless, she is quite ruthless in having her own way with the man. And the Jewish commentators draw attention to the fact that there is a connection. This would be typical, of course, for the rabbinic commentators who regard the Bible as literally the Word of God, and therefore any syntactical formulation which resembles another means that the ideas are similar. In verse 16 on page 111 we read, Vatetse Leah likrator, and Leah went out, and the opening verb of chapter 34 is Vatetse Dinah. And the rabbis rather unflatteringly draw attention to the fact that Leah came on so heavy in sexual matters with her husband that she produced a daughter who lacked discretion in sexual matters. I would like to know how short Dinah's skirt was when she went out frolicking in the fields, and what kind of clothes she was wearing, what kind of makeup she was wearing. In other words, I will not accept this black and white notion that men are the predators and women are also the... Take it easy, I'll give you a chance. I'm just finishing my point, okay? And therefore, from this point of view, I think the story does not necessarily appear to be what it is. The rabbis, curiously, this is the only comment they really have to make on the chapter, indicate that in their opinion, Dinah did not behave with appropriate virginal modesty. She got her comeuppance, and the reason was she was a true daughter of her mother, or in rabbinic parlance, a chip off the old block, that she picked up from Leah, that one did not have to be too withdrawing or backward in this matter, and in fact, this was the I'm not saying I'm agreeing with this or disagreeing with it, I'm simply the messenger that brings the news. Mimi? Yes, that's another good question. That is a very, very good question. Namely, why, when the brothers finally do their foul deed and get the men to circumcise themselves and then kill them, why is it only at that point do they remove Dinah from Shechem's tent? This again raises the question which the rabbis raise, why did she go out anyway? That is to say, why would a young virgin who has all these brothers and a father, all these males, go out alone in the field in a country surrounded by strangers? Because the condition of the Israelites at this point in history was that they were a minority, very much a minority. It was in a sense asking for trouble, and Mimi raises the question, why didn't she try to escape? Jewish tradition draws a distinction in matters of rape between whether the rape takes place in the open field where the woman could not have cried for help and whether the rape takes place in town. That is to say, if the rape takes place in a place where the woman could have made a noise and drawn attention and did not do so, the assumption in Jewish law, biblical law at least, is that the woman is guilty. However, in the field, the argument is that whatever she did wouldn't have done any good because nobody would have listened anyway. It doesn't really work in New York City today because if you have a knife at your throat, it doesn't really invite one to make a noise. So we would have to reconsider that issue anyway. But I also had the same thought that Mimi Liebe had. Why is she still there? Why didn't she try to run away? Perhaps Dinah also had the hots for this gentleman, and this would not be the first time in the history of the Jewish race that the daughter of a patriarch or some functional equivalent had ran off with a non-Jewish boy. We hear stories about this every day. Yes?
Don't you think she stayed because she knew what her brothers were going to do? It was like a trap. If she had left, then they would have thought that something was up. You know, it's like what you said before. It seems like a case of simple justice, you know. They were, the daughter of the patriarch gets raped, so the family retaliates. Maybe the family told her, you stay there until we get finished.
That's an interesting thesis. I present it. Again, I don't want to be accused of the views that I'm transmitting. I'm just transmitting them at the moment. The gentleman in the back thinks that Dinah was in the plan, or not overtly in the plan, but knew what was going to happen and decided, like, I suppose, like some of the other famous Jewish heroines, who is the lady in Judges 5 that deals with the, who takes the tent peg and strikes the nail through the head of Yael, and of course Devorah, and we have in the Apocrypha, we also have Judith who chops off the head of Holofernes, since we're approaching the Hanukkah story. So the gentleman at the back makes a good suggestion. We do have a group of women in Jewish history who were extraordinarily attractive, but also extraordinarily aggressive and very shrewd, and it could be that Dinah wasn't the naive little bobby soxer who accidentally walked out into the fields and was attacked by this horrible man, but in fact it was some kind of a preemptive strike. Maybe not before it happened. I'm not saying that Dinah was bait, but that once it did happen, Dinah immediately got onto the bandwagon and decided the best thing to do was to stay there, not to arouse suspicion. What you're saying is that she knew her brothers were capable of doing what they in fact did. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I'm also saying that since the Bible used the word rape, rape is not a two-way thing. You know, people get raped, you know, and I don't see how, I mean, this doesn't make any sense in my mind how somebody would willfully cooperate with that.
I'm sorry, could you make your point again?
All right, since the Bible says rape.
No, the Bible doesn't say rape. I'm sorry. We assume that it means rape, but I mean the Bible doesn't have a word for rape as such. Yes, go ahead.
I can't say what I was going to say then.
Please say it anyway.
All right. Well, see, it says by, you know, the translation rape. To me, rape is a one-way crime. You know, if it had said, she had gone into the fields with this man, and then these guys who did that, that would be a whole other thing entirely. But since it says rape, it's a case of justice. And it's a case of retribution. It has nothing to do with, to me, it doesn't make any sense about assimilation or about she wanted to be with this man. It's very clear, cut and dry.
You think, in other words, what you seem to be saying is that this man raped her, it's cut and dry, they deserved what they got.
Yes.
You do. Okay, good. That is definitely a position, and I'm glad you articulated it. Sir?
On the other hand, Shechem is not a bad catch of the son of the prince. And also, what's interesting to me is that he behaved, quote, honorably, if you will, having yielded to his desires, he married her.
Yes, Carl is making a very...
Quite a sufficient atonement there.
Yes, Carl is making a very interesting point. It is true, this is what I hear you saying, that Shechem raped Dinah, but he enjoyed it so much, he made her an offer that she couldn't refuse after it was all over. That's what the Bible, that's what you're saying. In other words, that he tried to make amends for something. You're not saying, you're not justifying what he did, but that after it was over, he decided that he really loved this woman and wanted to marry her. Ethel? I can't hear Ethel, I'm sorry. Would you stand? I'm sorry, I can't hear. I don't know what's going on. Shh, I'm sorry, could we listen to one person at a time? Thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Concerning Jacob, instead of being morally indignant, all he was concerned about was his security and his goods. Another indication of character.
Yes, that last bit is very sad when Jacob's reaction to the whole business is, Not that he has any moral reaction against what has taken place. I wouldn't mind if he took the position. What is your name at the back, young man? Alex, okay. If he had taken Alex's position, I can understand. If he'd said, look, this is a rotten thing that the guy did, they deserved it, and that's it, and we did it. Instead, he says, I'm afraid of what people will say. I'm not objecting to what was done, but you'll make me look bad. That's what he's saying. You'll make me look bad. I can't help thinking at this moment of that he has a very good role model in the biblical God, who is prepared to destroy the entire people of Israel in the wilderness because he's fed up with their complainings, but he's wondering what it'll look like in the New York Times the next day. And in fact, Moses plays on this point. It's quite clear in the discussions in the wilderness between God and Moses that the reason why God doesn't wipe the Jewish people out, which he would like to do, is only because it wouldn't look good. And Moses plays on this. He says, what's going to happen? They'll say, you brought them out, you did all this, and then you wiped them out. And God says, you're right, I look bad. It will look bad in the press. I get a bad press. It won't look good. My image will suffer. So therefore, I won't destroy them completely. The lady right at the back. Could you stand, please? That's a very interesting question. What was the status of a Jewish, an Israelite, the word Jewish is an anachronism, I presume you'll realize it. Up to the 6th pre-Christian century, we talk about Hebrews and Israelites. It's only after the destruction of the temple in 586 we talk of Jews. So, what was the condition of a Hebrew lady in the biblical period who had lost her virginity? Not good, as far as one can make out from the Bible. It certainly was some kind of marital defect. That's raised an interesting question. You're saying she reckoned in for a penny, in for a pound, that she was there already. She might as well stay there.
She was
Damned either way. Madam, you make an excellent point. I can't deny it. Richard. Interesting point. Richard says that it's a case of massive overkill, that the reaction is wild. No matter how bad one rape is, it seems that to requite one rape with a massacre of all the males of the entire group and plundering every single piece of property they had was a grossly excessive reaction, no matter how bad the crime was to begin with. And I must say, this year, the image came to me for the first time. It sounds very much like something that might have taken place in Sicily in connection with the mafia. It has this kind of global approach. Norman, did you have your hand up? In other words, you did not like the way Jacob was not interested in the morality. He didn't talk about the rape or the reaction, but what it will look like. Yes. Yes, in other words, he's saying, you've made life dangerous for us. Not that it was bad what you did, or good, or whatever. In other words, he doesn't say bad or good. He simply says, you've made my life more insecure. You've made things more difficult for me. Just one second. Yes. Dr. Goldberg. I'm sorry? I didn't get the word. Oh, the plunder, yes. Yes.
And you wonder which came first, the plunder and then the justification, or the rape and then the plunder. There's very mixed stuff in the story.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a concern that I also had, and we touched on it very, very vaguely, briefly before. Was this a preemptive, Alex's point in the back row raised this question, was this a preemptive strike? In other words, you know, in the 1938s and 39s, those of us who remember, there were always incidents going along on the German-Polish border. And very often what happened was the Germans wanted to do something, so an incident would be created, and then they'd go in and do it. So you had your justification, and then, in other words, you needed to do something, you created a justification, and then went in and did it. The question is here, was there some desire to take over the property and whatever of these people, and this was an occasion that cropped up. Yes, sir. Could you stand? Oh, that's a very fine point. It's not in the Bible, that's a rabbinic point, that's a midrashic point, yes.
So if she was hidden from his relatives, you know, from her own flesh and blood, why would she set out, you know, go into the land where they're surrounded by these strangers?
Well, you could be, you're asking an interesting question, but the two halves of what you're saying could be related. It may be that a girl is so incredibly overprotected so that she can't even spend time with her own kith and kin, decides to go out and spend some time with foreigners, which incidentally reminds me of another rabbinic comment which says that Shechem didn't just meet Dinah in the fields, he knew of her existence and wanted her before the occasion arose for the rape. And in fact, he set up the situation so that he would get her out. He played some Billy Joel records in the field, and or whatever would have brought her out. I really don't know. I just bring that from the back of my head. He had a party, and there was music, and he played the music loud enough so that Dinah heard, and her feet began to twitch. You know what happens when you hear music and you want to go and dance, and you go and get involved yourselves. Yes, back row.
I think there may be something else going on in this story. Shechem says to the townspeople to induce them to go along with this deal of being circumcised, but we'll be able to absorb these people. We'll be able to get all their goods, they'll dwell with us, and gradually we'll absorb them. But this, presumably, this is Chumash is the story of how we got to be here today, that we've been absorbed by Shechem. So
Yes, that is a very important point, and which we should not overlook, that the Hivites were not a bunch of sweet peas either. That when this event had taken place, one of the aspects of dealing with it that occurred to them was that if we go along with these people and become Hebrews, Israelites, circumcised like they are, it's true on one level it looks as if we're adopting their religion, but we're so smart we'll take them over. We'll take over the entire operation. So we have to see that on some level the two sides deserved each other. Eliezer? Okay, Eliezer is drawing our attention to our Western limitations, that in the Middle East to this day, if a family has a daughter who gets raped, then it's a blood feud. At least this is what I understand. But Eliezer, would they go and massacre the entire tribe?
I would say that at that time, not a city, what we call Shechem, most probably was a family. Yeah? One family used to, I assume I wasn't there, but I assume that was the situation. And even today, when they go out from Makdan, they will kill anybody they get a hold of. That's exaggerated, okay? It's too much killing there, but it is a common situation even today. Israel has a problem with the Arabic villages when they try to settle those laws among themselves in their own way.
Yes, I think the point is well made. That that this kind of an offense is treated very, very seriously in the Middle East, and there would be this massive overkill response. Jerry?
Even though that may be the way people avenge rape or crimes, I think the people who sanctified this reading had a purpose, and it wasn't to simply say, this is the way the world is, and these are the rules of justice. I think the point has to be that something justified all of that beyond the rape, and I think it's the issue of assimilation. I think the trouble I have with this is that I don't react as violently to the notion of assimilation as the people in this tribe did. And I think they had to, and maybe we should. But I think that's what makes the whole understanding of this and the feeling of this so difficult. That the values that lead to what is right, what's wrong, what's justified, how big a retaliation is justified.
Yes.
It comes from how big is the threat.
Yes.
And assimilation was the very big threat that these people faced. And I think that's what it's about.
Yes, well, Jerry raises another question that it deals with assimilation, and this has always been a very, very sore topic in Jewish circles. Apart from a very brief period at the time of, about the time of Jesus, when Jews were very much, Jewish religion was very much a proselytizing religion. I don't know whether people still remember that, but I mean, they weren't there, of course. But there was a brief period of time in Jewish history when we were active proselytizers. We really went out and tried to convert people to Judaism. But once Christianity rose, proselytizing ceased in Jewish history for a variety of reasons, and there is something in what Jerry said which made me realize that this whole business, when a non-Jewish group says intermarry with us, something sets up Jewish hackles. There's a feeling, it's not so much a question that they're inferior people, Jerry, it's a question of can the values of Judaism be sustained if we mingle on this level and take in people who don't have this sort of stuff with their mother's milk, as it were. The difference between being born with something or adopting something at a later stage. I don't know whether you were raising this question, but I want to raise it because what you said sparked it in me, which is a question that I've also thought of. Whether or not there was a rape, whether or not the brothers of Dinah overreacted, whether or not Dinah was in cahoots with these guys or not, why is this in the Bible? This is the sacred text of the Jewish people. Any group that was writing its history, you would think would have enough sense to edit this stuff out. I'm asking, this is a very serious question, and of course it's bound up with the central issue of Jewish theology. For example, in the Masechet, in the tractate in the Talmud, the Mishnah, which deals with Pesach, the observance of the Passover, there's a very interesting principle which governs the way in which the story of the Seder, the story of the Passover, the story of the Exodus from Egypt is told in Jewish homes on Passover at the Seder table. And the principle goes, Matchil bignut u'mesayem bishvach. It's funny that it goes like that because obviously this statement must have been made before the Haggadah was put together, because it doesn't refer to the Haggadah text. It simply says, when we tell the story of the departure from Egypt on the eve of Passover, that is to say, when we, on the occasion of the birthday of the Jewish people, because that's what Pesach is. Pesach is the birthday of the Jewish people. It's a time when we sit down and we tell the story of how the Jewish people began. Once upon a time, and we tell the story of the Jewish people. And the rabbis say, when you tell this story, when on the eve of Passover you tell the story of the Jewish people, do it warts and all. You know the story that Cromwell was once being painted and the painter asked him whether he wanted to paint everything. Well, Cromwell apparently had a rather scruffy face, and the statement, whether it's true or not, Cromwell is supposed to have said to the painter, warts and all. In other words, he wanted an honest picture. He didn't want something that was touched up. So, Matchil bignut u'mesayem bishvach, the rabbis say, when you tell the history of the Jewish people, don't be afraid to let it all hang out. Start with the bad stuff and let it end with the better stuff. And that's why in the Passover Haggadah we have the phrase Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And the question is often asked, why does the Jewish people do that? They're insane. Every group at a certain point in its history, whether it's an ethnic group or a bank or an advertising corporation, decides to write its story. And it wants to write its story the best way. The myth of a people doesn't get written at the beginning. The myth of the people usually gets written long after the beginning when it's a viable concern, and then the people look back and say, let somebody write a book about us. You know, let somebody put it down. And most groups don't put down the bad stuff. In Jewish tradition, there's a long, deep-seated tradition to tell the bad stuff first. Get it off your chest. It's like the story of the man who was called Shapinsky, who changed his name to Smith and then changed his name to Jones. And when they said to him, why did you change your name twice? He said, well, when they asked me what was your name before, it was Jones, I'll tell them it was Smith. In England, there was a kind of an exodus that Jews used to make. You were born in the East End, you moved to Stamford Hill, you went to Golders Green, you then went to Hampstead Garden Suburb, and then went to East Grinstead. So you sometimes moved even further, so if they said to you, where did you live before you went to East Grinstead, you could say somewhere else, or whatever. A lot of people have difficulty in saying, my father was a tailor, and he lived in the Lower East Side. Do you know what I'm talking about? A lot of people have enormous difficulty. When I meet with people on the occasion of bereavements or sorrow or grief, I like to find out about the person who has died very often, because sometimes I've never heard of it before. In fact, sometimes when it involves non-members of the congregation, I don't even know that the man existed. Here am I supposed to get all emotionally involved with somebody whose existence I didn't know about until a telephone call 10 minutes ago. And they come in, they sit down, and I ask them questions. I ask them to bring in pictures, sometimes clippings from papers, whatever, a description of what the person did or didn't do, and information. I remember one occasion, in all innocence and guile, I said, did your father go to college, or where did your father go to college? And the daughter stood up and screamed at me and stormed out of the room. Why do you think that could have happened? The issue of whether or not her father had not had an education. He was a very successful man. He died a millionaire, but he dropped out of school. And the family felt badly about that. Another family might have been only too proud that their father, without any benefits of a formal education, succeeded the way he did. But this young woman was totally unable. She wasn't so young. This woman was unable to deal with this. Obviously, it was a massive chip on her shoulder that the father had not had an education, which she couldn't deal with. And the innocent asking of the question, did your father go to college, or where did your father go to college, she couldn't stay in the room. She had to go and find somebody else to perform the ceremony. Yes?
Maybe she thought it was like a social question, like if someone went to college, they were in a higher social class than someone.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. That it was Julie thinks that maybe the question was misinterpreted as a social question. Where does a rabbi come off asking social questions when he's asking for information about a eulogy? But of course, in the context of the other questions that were being asked, it was part of the cloth. And I think, Julie, you probably recognize that sometimes when somebody asks a question which is innocent, but you've got a lot of aggravation inside over that issue straight away, you tend to fly off the handle when this question is asked. Yes, sir?
Who was Dina supposed to marry? Uncle Asa? Or who wasn't a Gentile?
I have no information. But, however, the question is a good question, because we know in those days there weren't enough nice Jewish girls to go around anyway, if I may speak metaphorically. And there was a tremendous amount of intermarriage. We know for a fact, for example, it can be said quite objectively that we are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in a purely metaphorical sense. There is no such thing as a Jewish race. And volumes have been written on the subject. Yes? No, I'm sorry, Peretz, you did already speak. I'd like to ask you again. We have a lot of offers this morning. Yes, Jeff.
only in fact and not in spirit. They did not
They lack the culture of their own people now. They lack the strength of Judaism. They had nothing. They were totally without strength and could easily be overcome. Now, if there's any reason for this to be in here, it has to do with surface commitments or true commitments.
Yeah, well, Jeff, yeah, of course, from a historical point of view, Jeff, the fact is that there was no religious conversion at that time at all. Even as late as the time of the 5th pre-Christian century, there was no religious conversion. The way in which you became a member of the Hebrew or Israelite people at that point in history was simply to live with that people, share their destiny, and in case of being a male, adopt the ritual of circumcision. Could you, what is the point that you're making? You're angry with them for doing that? No, well, there was a lack, there seems to be a lack of sincerity on both sides here. I just want to make quite sure the point I was making before in response to what Jerry said is understood. Our Torah is a very unusual, the Bible as a whole, but only the 5 books are in the Ark, is a very unusual book. Unusual in the sense that it is a book in which, in the phrase of Cromwell, warts and all. In other words, the Bible contains within itself that which challenges the Bible's right to call itself a sacred text. There are enormous psychological ramifications and implications here, and I just want to make that point. That is to say, this is not a chapter to be proud of, but it apparently never occurred to the Jewish people to abridge the Bible and cut out the bad bits. They regarded those bad bits, insofar as they were bad, as part of the story they had to tell, and they had to be open about it. Leah? Another wart in verse 29.
I want to know whether in that translation you see it as the Hebrews also raping the wives of the men.
Absolutely, there's no question about it. In fact, it probably means that they destroyed them, because I don't think they would have married with them. It looks as if their wealth, the little ones, their wives, they took captive and spoiled even all that was in the house. Well, it doesn't say explicitly that they were killed, but certainly they would be regarded, they would have been made slaves, and therefore it adds up to the same thing, more or less, yes. Yes, Rabbi Golden. Florence, I'll get you right now.
In most biblical stories, we find that God appears either by himself or through an angel. The name of God significantly is missing. However, immediately after this story in chapter 35, verse 1, his name does appear, and he says, forget the whole business. He takes no sides whatsoever. He says, just get rid of the idol, and everything's all right.
Right. Does that present you with a surprise, Rabbi Goldman?
I don't know. I'd like to comment.
Oh, I ask you a question. How do you like that? How does it sit with you? It doesn't sit well with you, does it? It doesn't sit well. We are embarrassed at the thought that the God of chapter 35 is able to say to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar unto God who appeared to thee when thou didst flee from the face of Esau thy brother, while the screams of the Hivite women and children are still ringing in their ears. And I would just want to draw the attention of our visitors today that this is a Reconstructionist congregation. Putting it at its simplest, we assume an evolutionary attitude towards the sacred texts of Judaism, by which I mean that we believe, in the words of our founder, Mordecai Kaplan, the Bible does not tell us about God. The Bible tells us what our ancestors believed about God, which is a whole different kettle of fish. Let me just say that once more. The Bible, according to our way of looking at it, does not tell us about God. It tells us about how the Hebrews believed, how our ancestors believed about God, and their views evolved over the years. Chapter 35 of Genesis is not a very high level of that belief in God. This God is a very chauvinistic, bigoted God who is exclusively interested in his own and not very much interested in anybody else. Florence?
What bothers me about this is kind of in a vacuum. It's true they don't believe it. They put the chapters in and we all have our own reaction to it. Then they don't mention Dinah again. What did she think of it? Did she like what her brother did? Did she have any feelings about it? And the next chapter, there's nothing. It's like junk.
Well, yes. All right. I'll pick up that point later on. It's a very important point. Gentleman in the back row.
Maybe Dinah is not that story. Maybe she's the basis for telling a story about group relations, which indeed the people that put this in the Bible were proud of. Maybe they're saying it's important to be insincere with those that are insincere. It's important to have group identity. It's important to be proud among people to avenge wrongs if that's the way an outsider decides to make contact. And the position of Levites as becoming circumcised is the most unbelievable part of all. This is read by this passion. One says, gee, if they're acting that way, one should really be suspicious about who these people are and who they are. We can find words all over. I think if we get them to the intent of the people that wrote a book for us, we shouldn't just be picking at the words of our own group. We ought to be seeing what might they be the flavor with respect to their invitation to group by the way. Now, I think that Jacob is being criticized. I'd like to make the other point too. Maybe Jacob is being indeed the overstatesman saying, there is no room merely for passion and God in the immediate situation determining group relations. We have to be concerned with what's going to happen in the future if we do stuff like this. And so maybe Jacob is saying to son, yes, the military acts this way because they're engaged in battle, but the overstatesman is here and must regulate and control these kinds of murderous impulses to revenge because they may be very consequences.
Thank you. Joel?
In response to what was just said for a moment, even though he's acting as the elder statesman, it was only from a political and not moral standpoint. There's no moral judgment. There isn't even any moral justice in here, at least when Shimon committed his irrational act. We assume for the moment that a rape is not a non-rational act. He woke up the next morning and said, I did something wrong. I'm going to try to rectify the situation. I will offer to marry her. Jacob didn't do anything wrong. Simeon and Levi turned around the next morning. They woke up and said, well, we were justified. They didn't understand, and they don't at the end of the chapter, that they were acting in an irrational fashion and that there might be something wrong with it. And they continue to deny that there was any moral problem with the irrational act.
Myron.
I must say, I want to take issue with being critical of the chapter since I haven't liked it very much. I don't think that there is anything morally wrong with what goes on in that chapter, as long as one doesn't take it literally. And one takes it in the sense that this is one expression of what people who have no power can do, or a person without power can do, and some of the consequences. When I was growing up, I had a brother and sister who were 6 and 8 years younger than I, and like you grew up in a non-Jewish neighborhood. And she wore a yarmulke and walked with a siddur in your hand, going back and forth from Talmud Torah. You talk to my brother, he got beaten up almost all the time. I was the one who went out because I was very large and to take care of the kids who went back and forth up and down that block that they had to travel. And I find nothing wrong with going back and hitting and doing all of that when it's necessary. That line at the end of the chapter that says, and it's a rhetorical question, but it's got to hit every Jew over and over again. Shall our sister be treated as a whore? And that's the way the chapter ends. And if I lived in the first century of the Roman period, what would be the effect of that line on me? Here is a way of reacting to what's happened to them and the desire to strike out and to hit, and in the story they actually do. I know that 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds are very much into fighting and doing all this kind of thing with bad guys and good guys. And I think a dichotomy was created here to fulfill some kind of real need, and it feels good to read it sometimes.
Okay.
I don't find anything wrong with it.
All right. Yes, lady in the back row.
I accept in justifying or rectifying a rape with a marriage. The two don't go together.
Yes.
I said it's one thing to do a rape and then run away from it, and another thing to honor would go to the father of the woman and say, I want to take this woman and marry her, I love her. All right, so maybe the rapist is wrong thing and came first, but the man actually did go to the father and offered to do this with an
Yeah. Well, that's a sort of a response to what was said before. David?
I'd like to suggest that perhaps Dina was a prostitute after all, or else she was fine with being a prostitute. Because after all, who were these daughters of the land? She went out to see the daughters of the land. I wonder if that was a group of ladies out in the field. Or perhaps even then...
Well, that's a very striking observation. Frederick? Frederick?
I wonder whether the truth of that story has to do with two coming that may die. Jacob, as he died, fled Judah. He committed Reuben because of his involvement with Bilhah, and Shimon and Levi were excluded because of these events. I wonder what came first.
That's a very interesting point, Frederick. It is true that in the blessing that Jacob gives his sons at the end of the book of Genesis, he specifically points out that Shimon and Levi, because of what they did in this chapter, are excluded from his love, from his affection, because they were violent and they were destroyers. And the point that's being made here is, if it was necessary for the succession to go through Judah, then it would be important to vilify or neutralize the importance of the other brothers, and if that need were there, a story of this order might have to be written in order to justify it. That would make the authors of the Bible a little more devious than even I expect of them, but it's something that we could think about. Yes, Charles?
To take a couple of steps back, there's one thing that's very obvious about this story is that if you realize that it was written by, or written down by Hebrews, Israelites, but then it must be looked at in a light to get at the truth behind this personal retraction through prejudice, and in a light that is far less favorable to the Jews, to the Israelites, than it actually is presented here.
I don't get your point, Charles. I'm sorry.
It was written by people who were basically, whose attitude was in favor of their own people.
Surely.
Right. Therefore, you could assume that the truth of the story, or the truth of the inherited story, is actually less favorable to the very people who are writing this and about whom it is being written, namely the Israelites. All right, point number one. Point number two, the insertion and the continuing survival of this story indicates that in it there is a traumatic experience for a people. The very discussion that we are having here seems to be the very purpose for which this story was inserted here and for which it survived. Because it represents a continuing dilemma. And that really is its value. Not whether he should have, Dinah should have done this or Jacob should have done that, but the very character, the composite character of all the elements in this story make it a very forceful thing and something that goes on living because it represents a continuing problem that is with us to this day.
Yep. Yes. Could you talk a little louder, please?